This is Embrace Zoe, the podcast that celebrates struggles turned into strength. Truth is, life's uphill battle will either make you or break you. After every episode, I pray you're empowered knowing you have the spark that it takes to rise up in the dark and truly understand the power of light. I'm Michelle Salinas. Join me as we navigate the grief cycle, the model that helps people understand their emotions, with licensed professional counselor Reagan Villanueva. If you believe knowledge is power, then this in-depth conversation will transform how you view and process struggles moving forward. We're bringing in a topic that either you really want to hear from a licensed professional counselor or you really don't. And if that's you listening to this, then this is the episode for you. Welcome, Embrace Zoe, this community to empower and remind us that in our vulnerability, we are made strong. And Reagan, it is my true pleasure to share this platform with you today.
Oh, Michelle, it's my delight to be here with you. Like, as always, it's just a joy. Yeah.
And you know what we're talking about today is not very joyous. It is a tough conversation, and I will say culturally speaking. Now, things have shifted, but in my generation, there was still not this big push in my household to talk about feelings and struggles and potentially how parental decisions that may have caused some trauma upon me would eventually build me up to be the adult I am today. And normally, as I think back, I don't remember my mother or father saying, I am feeling a sense of mourning. I am struggling with anxiety. I just saw two professionals who would wake up and do the thing. Underlyingly, you understood there was a little bit more going on. But it wasn't until I had to be going through my own grieving in my life, in a time where I thought I should have been the most happy, that you so beautifully enlightened me.
Yes. Yes. The
It
grief cycle is a hard topic for people to engage. And yet it is, in my opinion, it is possible that it is a pervasive soil in which people are planted. And when they don't understand what it is that they are experiencing, they then judge themselves, or shame comes in, or other people don't understand. And therefore, for me, in my profession, but also in my personal life and in my own journey, learning to understand and name the phases of grief, the dynamic processes of being in a grief cycle, grief journey, a grieving life, has brought layers of healing that I did not imagine were possible. And so I teach my clients a lot about their language that illuminates when they are grieving, and I help them to name the aspects of grief, therefore helping them to tame, contain, or figure it out, and therefore be able to drain some of that grief from their experience. Yeah.
it's almost inevitable if you are living and breathing today and listening or seeing us. There must have been a phase of the grief cycle that you've endured or that you're currently in. Help us really understand what are the different phases of the grief cycle.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is foundational in the language we now hold of the grief cycle. She studied those who were dying and tried to actually find common ground among phases that people went through when they were dying. So the original grief cycle was birthed out of that process, and her book on death and dying is that work. What she found was that there were 5 common phases that people went through: denial, bargaining, anger, depression, or you could call it sadness, and then acceptance. what I have found in my own life journey, and I think has now been elaborated, transformed into those who are left behind and those who are living, is that there is a sixth phase of grief, and it is called hope or meaning making.
Mm,
All of these phases, one, they are not linear, meaning you don't go very neatly from denial to bargaining to anger. There's no time frame. You bounce around. That's why it's called a cycle. It's something you move in and out of in intensity. And yet I'm beginning to, what is true for my story, and I am beginning to wonder about humanity in general, is when life brings sorrow and we begin to grieve, sometimes we can make meaning of that grief. Does that then mean that we are done with the grief cycle? If we are making meaning and we have hope, are we not still in the grief cycle? So therefore, the way that I verbalize it for my own story is that the roots of my life are deeply planted in the soil of grief, and therefore I am always grieving. However, a beautiful and hopeful redemptive aspect is that the more that I sink into grief and I let the roots sink deeply into the holy ground of grief, right? The more exponentially I find in opposite to it, my gratitude grows. And delight, joy, um, relishing, deliciousness. That is what is found in between. When I have learned to hold both of them as true, I do not need to be done with the grief process. I can hold that in grieving, I understand what gratitude truly is, because when grievous things happen, and then I have the French word is denouement,
mm,
resolution. Okay. There's like a,
yeah.
okay. When that moment comes, it's in recognition of the sorrow, the anger, the disillusionment that I have faced, and therefore it has more meaning for me. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Now, what I want to make sure as we deep dive into this, because there's so many beautiful layers to it, is that we're not talking just the grief cycle because someone passed. So let's be clear in that. Now, there, of course, will be a space where you have those emotions
Absolutely.
and found emotions too if you didn't get closure with that individual, etc., where you tap into these different phases. But that this could come, right, Reagan, from a relationship lost, a loss of a child, a loss of a pet, a loss of a job, an
The
identity.
loss of a dream.
Ooh,
It can be intangible. It can be that I had expectations for what it would feel like to enter into this new job. And then I find that it is not what I thought it would be. Boom, I'm in the grief cycle.
oh,
It's not just about the loss of a being, it's about gaining something that we perceived would be this way, and we find it is this way, and we don't know how to make sense of what we lost in our fantasies, our hopes, our expectations. Does that make sense?
yes, yes, it absolutely does. Which completely solidifies in this conversation for me the fact that I can feel comfortable getting rooted in the soil of the grief cycle because as you just mentioned, my gratitude does also grow. Now, I personally, um gratitude is a form. I, in my story, um do look at it more as redemption for me.
That word.
But I think, like, just in general, it's this concept of being so low that you have reached a new high, because it propelled you into newfound healing, as you've mentioned, newfound strength, newfound self-control,
Yeah.
newfound joy. Is it necessary when you speak to clients, is it necessary to have in the grief cycle this opportunity of surrender, of literally going from this holding on to release? Is that part of what one can be counseled or helped through to do to allow themselves to, like you said, maybe sustain the phase they're in a little bit better?
Maybe surrender would be a word that we would hold on to. Um, I think other people um, might hold a different kind of language. And that's why I think helping people understand when they are outing themselves about the phase of grief they are in through what they say, that language literally exposes the phase of grief that people are in. And if we can help our friends, if I can help my clients, if I can name this with my children, or my husband, like, oh, it sounds like you're grieving because of the language they are giving. We are helping to validate what they are experiencing and giving them the space without judgment to
Mm,
explore the phase of grief they're in, which then does help them move through or digest that aspect of the grief process with less self-condemnation, with less others' condemnation, because, you know, I am sure the Latina culture is has its own ways of navigating grief. I come from Southern Mississippi, lived in Louisiana, in Arkansas, now in Texas. The Southern culture, the Christian culture, I don't think they're very good at validating grief. I think there's a lot of phrases that people use that cut someone off from being able to validate the grief they're in, or hijack them away from being able to sit in that space. So something that I teach people fairly early in a therapeutic process is about how to validate the grief they're in so that they don't feel shame or
mm,
don't misunderstand and therefore think they're doing something bad or wrong to feel the way they feel. For example, anger, Michelle. Southern Christian women are told it is not okay to be angry. But if anger is the natural, normal part of the grief process, what do we do then? So if we can validate that, why is this happening to me, is actually a brilliant indicator of grief work, and say, looks like you're grieving well. Wait a minute,
wow.
but I'm angry. Yes. And anger is a part of the grief cycle. Does that make sense? Language.
Yes.
So critical to validating someone's grief.
Mm, that is amazing. But you touched on a point, and I am trying to get better at this myself. When especially in this world of social media, where a lot of us now are sharing what is causing us the grief. Whether that's, I had a really difficult day, my tire popped, didn't make it to the job interview, I've been trying so hard. I'm just making all this up, but I feel like I'm pulling from nuggets of posts that I have read.
Sure.
And the first thing I want to do, because I am an Enneagram 8, and I have this doer's mentality over everything. I also have this compassion. I always want to wrap somebody in my, I call them capable arms, but most of the time they're just tired. And I want to say, come here, everything's gonna be okay. And I found the older, and what I hope I am becoming wiser, the wiser that I can become in awareness of what you just said, that sometimes not saying something is the right thing to do when somebody shares that they
Right.
are in a grief cycle. And if they're in the grief cycle, perhaps there is a way on the flip side where we can educate ourselves to empower people as they digest the different phases.
Yes. So the the language, I wouldn't say in response to your language, I wouldn't say that saying nothing is is best. I think sometimes saying nothing can be helpful. Um, I would say that what I attempt to do is to help hold someone where they are and validate what they are saying without giving advice or telling them something. So that would, for me, sound like, wow, I hear that. That sounds hard. I'm here and I am with you in it, or I want to be with you in it, because everyone's grief process is so unique, and it's not my job to fix it, nor is it my job to tell someone whether they are in a grief cycle or not in a grief cycle. I can point out language, I can reflect when something is coming up that seems like grief and be curious with them. But when someone's talking about something hard, to just hold them in that space and, wow, that stinks. That sounds hard.
Mhm.
That allows them the space to say, yes, it does. And it is hard. And that allows them the safety to know they're right on track. Because of course, when we're grieving, where do we want to be? Anywhere other than where we are.
Yeah, no kidding.
And and yet when we are grieving and we happen to feel this in the grief cycle or wonder this in the grief cycle, we cannot be anywhere other than where we are. So for another human to just say you're right on track and I'm with you in it, gives them so much space and freedom to just be where they are without judgment. Because the
Mhm.
one thing we know is that they want to be somewhere else. They don't want to be feeling what they're feeling,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yes. So one part of the cycle that I you've also taught me and I think is groundbreaking, but also at the same time challenging, is that you could be in two places at once, two
Absolutely.
faces. So, for instance, I could be I could be in the depression side and I could be in the denial side. How can one learn to find the tools to navigate? Because I would imagine that each phase has a different format for you to process it.
I don't think there is one solid answer for that question. For some people, I think they could come up with a prescription that best fits who they are. And I think for other people, it may feel like wandering in the dark with no map and no flashlight. And I think to be able to name where we are, what we are experiencing, can almost help us bind how bad it feels to be in that space when we get the validation that, okay, this is what I am experiencing. I don't like it. I remember asking my own therapist, okay, what do I do? How do I do this thing called grief? And how long is it going to take?
Yes.
How long is it going to take? So give me this prescription. And I remember I literally learned what empathy felt like from the look on my therapist's face. And she would just look at me with empathy because she is a grief and loss specialist. So I learned from the best that there is no prescription that is just right for all people, and there is no way to determine how. How can a human go through from denial to awareness, right? How can we go from bargaining to, in essence, um, holding what is true and letting it be what it is, right? How can we go from anger to, some would say that the antidote to anger would be forgiveness. So, forgiveness of self, acknowledgement, in that space? How can we go from depression to a space of neutrality at best, or joy and delight, um, as an overflow, right? And then how do we know the difference between acceptance and denial? Because there's a real fine line between those. They both sound like it's fine. So how are you after the death of your mother? I'm fine. I'm fine. It's fine. Well, for some, that's denial, head in the sand, just like an ostrich, and they're going, ah, la, 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 la. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. I'm
Yeah.
fine. I'm fine. And for others, it is, well, I've been grieving this loss that was coming due to ongoing illness. And in some ways, there's relief and deep sorrow, but I am okay.
Mm.
You see how I don't get to judge which of those is true. I just get to reflect what I hear in the language and be curious with them and hold that space with them.
Mhm. What I feel I'm finding is that the more we learn about the grief cycle, the more it normalizes our humanity.
Absolutely. And for those who adhere to a biblical mindset, and of course, I am open to all kinds of different ways of thinking about things. But the Bible is very clear. In this life, you will have suffering, but take heart, I have overcome this life. Jesus's words, he promised us that we will suffer. Well, when people suffer, that is sad. And sometimes it makes us angry. And sometimes we don't want to think about it. And sometimes we try to get out of it, which is the bargaining phase. So if we're promised it, then it absolutely feels helpful to learn about ways that we can normalize it and champion each
Mhm,
other in
mhm.
the process of moving through and digesting out the intensity of the sorrow so that we're holding greater radical acceptance about the suffering we experience in this beautiful journey called life.
And beautiful at that for sure. And I believe that when some may hear about, what phase are you in? And especially if you're in the denial phase, you are likely not even going to want to talk about the fact that you're in denial phase. So, what can one do? I mean, it sounds like the first step truly is validation acceptance. Does that sound like the first two power tools to kind of physically hold when starting the journey of
That also is a good question. And to me, I could be wrong. So correct me if you're thinking something different. When I hear that, the first phase, what I hear and see is a linear process. But
oh,
what I know to be true is that grief is not linear. Therefore, someone may start angry. Someone else may start, you know what? It is what it is, which is acceptance. Someone else may start by going to start a foundation that which is the hope and meaning making phase. Like I can't, there is no prescription, which is
mm,
part of what makes it quite discombobulating. Um, okay, even in my home, my two sisters and I, so the three of us experienced a similar family, event, and we all three grieved in a very different way, very different timeline, and it took us decades to look back and go, "Oh, you were in denial. I was angry, and you were sad." But those hit around a similar event, and yet we experienced them very differently. And in learning how to just let other people be where they are, so that kind of helps, I think, explain how grief is so individual,
yes.
and yet it is also in some ways very collective.
Mm,
Right? Cultures grieve different losses, right? Nations grieve different losses, but every single person's grief process is so unique. And we are so untrained in the language of grief. Oftentimes, our language adds a little bit more pain when we do not understand that when we are looking at someone who is angry on the back end of something grievous, that they're doing just fine. Or when someone is in depression and sorrow and sadness, it's not something to rescue someone from.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, that one right there.
Which tells me that oftentimes when you get to a low space in your own grief process, it's the thing you want to jump out of the fastest, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. And back to how, you were raised and what was portrayed as normal or okay. I remember, for instance, my father was a workaholic, and for him, I believe that dealing with his own grief cycle in being in and out of multiple phases, it was easier to just go, 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 go. So, and
absolutely.
because I saw what go, go, go got him in the material things, right? Like he has a foundation in his practice and his career. And I'm not missing anything. Therefore, as a child, maybe didn't see the impacts of that go, go, go mentality right away, although I did later on, which I'm sure is another topic for another day for you and I. But so forth, it almost taught me then when I entered perhaps what could have been the starts of awareness of the grief cycle, that I needed to just go, 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 because that would eliminate. And truly, that now that I'm talking about it, it sounds like denial.
It is denial. That's brilliant. Well done. Well done. Like, look at that. I was literally going, oh, that's good denial work. Like, well done. You're
But
doing everything you can to escape and say it's okay and keep going and keep moving. And if we judge that, well, they're not sad, or, they're not like, that's not helpful. Everyone's doing the best they can do with the skills and knowledge they have at the time, and it's going to look so differently. And I'm not sure if this relates to an exact question you asked, but it seems poignant that some people's stories have brought enough harm to where they may not ever want, nor ought they be forced to get out of denial.
wow.
That's not my job to determine. It's no other human's right to say, well, you need to stop living in denial, or, well, it's time for you to move on from that phase. Some people may not be willing, and some people may not be able, and some people may not be both. And that's not mine to judge. It's just mine to observe. Now, impact wise, think about this, Michelle.
Mm,
What if you're moving through the grief cycle and truly committed to figuring out a way to have radical acceptance about a loss, and find a way to make meaning, and you're in close proximity or intimate relationship with someone who is not willing or not able to do that same thing?
uh-oh.
Then it puts you, the one who is willing and able and desirous, in a whole nother grief process. Therefore, you're not just grieving the original loss, you're grieving the fact that you are alone in processing through it, or processing in a different time frame, in a different order than someone you would want to be in it with.
Hmm.
That, talk about complicated.
Extremely. And as earlier, as you were talking about what is the right thing that you could potentially say, which is validate, um, I may then enter in that very situation scenario. I may quickly enter in my own character into anger because my once willingness to accept if you partner with me in this, now has turned into a new grief phase of now I'm angry because I was willing to move forward and accept, but now because of your lack of engagement in being in this with me, I'm now angry. And now
Mm.
you're going to get the wrath of Michelle.
Which the interesting part of that is it's my experience that anger like that can come from probably more than two, but often from one of two places. Um, I'm either angry that a violation has occurred, okay? And therefore, anger is the normal, natural human emotion to violation. So if someone has done something specific against me as I'm grieving, then I become angry. However, there's another space where that anger could come from, which is my expectation that my partner or close person would be in it with me in the same way, in the same time frame. And if that is where my anger is coming from, I'm actually angry at my own expectations, which then sends me into a third grief cycle
Oh no.
around my own expectations and how do I digest that I am not empowered over someone else's grief process. I don't have that jurisdiction. So then I have to step back into my own yard and grieve within myself that there is a loneliness. Like the grief journey is beautiful and it is gut wrenching. And I think so many people are in an active phase of grieving without the awareness of knowing what phase they're in or how to be okay, how to be okay right where they are. Does that make, because then they want someone else to be in that place with them because that's supposed to make it okay. Then I'm not alone. And we often don't get that.
I really love that you just said something, and I will share something very deep to me in my story. Um, we will handle all things motherhood at a later episode so that everybody can please look forward to that. But when my husband and I had our first child, I was in multiple layers of the grief cycle. And that was when you and I first connected, and I shared these very deep emotions. Um, and I remember sharing with him, Reagan, one night. I believe I had postpartum depression, though I didn't go through the appropriate steps to handle that. However, I remember just sobbing in bed and telling him, how dare I put, so exactly to what you just said, my own awareness, I put myself through this because I wanted to fulfill something that was so important to you and being a father that I put myself, so I'm condemning in this position of being a mother and not feeling connected to this new responsibility or identity, whatever you want to call it. Okay. And in the same time, my husband has never been happier than this moment. So his wife is saying, this is a devastating situation to my being, and somehow showed so much grace in holding me in this space, though he was feeling the ultimate joy of holding his newborn child whom he had it with the love of his life.
Mhm.
So I'm even wondering if I should say I'm sorry, but what I believe now is that what he did was validate me.
He held you in the space that you were in without judgment, and he did not need to be in that same space himself. That concept is called differentiation, where two humans are allowed to be equal, open, separate individuals, therefore have their own grief process and still love one another well wherever they find themselves.
Wow.
That is radical acceptance. Like That's the good stuff. And I love that you have that. I love that I have that. It's delicious. Yeah.
It is, and it honestly, it makes me so, vulnerable and overwhelmed as we talk about it. It almost just kinda sealed a beautiful feeling in my heart that I felt a lot of guilt and shame for a long time experiencing this phase. Because I wonder how many of us hearing this conversation are going, but I should be very happy, but I should not feel depression. I am successful in my career. I have a loving partner. I am doing great. My children are very great, or whatever it may be. I just traveled the world. But you can feel a lot of that shame, yet somehow you are okay to validate that.
That experience you just verbalized is bargaining in the grief cycle. I should feel this way, even though should is a shaming word. It's not my favorite. I don't use it very often. But another way bargaining can sound, if if I da 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 da, then da 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 da. So if I travel the world, then this won't feel this way. Or if I just get this other job, then maybe this won't be so bad. Or if he would just listen this way, then maybe I wouldn't feel alone. Or I have all of these things, therefore I ought not feel this way. Okay. That's all bargaining. We're trying to reason it out in our minds and in our hearts that this feeling, I want it to go away. So if I can rationalize a reason why it ought not be, then maybe it won't be. That is the phase called bargaining. Does that make sense? And
Absolutely.
if people could understand if then statements or this happened, therefore this ought to be true, the oughts, the shoulds, that all of that is bargaining, I wonder how much more they'd be able to validate when they're bargaining in the grief cycle and say, oh, well done, I'm grieving. I don't like it. I wish it wasn't true. And yet all my best bargaining is not making me feel differently. Therefore, it is what it is, which is acceptance
Mm.
does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And I wonder, because you do this work so beautifully, holding people in this space and educating, truly education, which I do believe is the power to everything, the knowledge. I wonder if you, over the course of years with clients, are able to see how much quicker, because they understand the faces, they can activate validation. And while, yes, it's not linear, maybe it's just softer on the soul. And maybe sometimes it's
Absolutely. Absolutely, Michelle. I see people come in and go, well, I'm doing really well with the anger phase of grief, and they're just laughing. Like they're aware, and therefore they have something to hold on to that validates it's okay to feel what I feel, and that this too will expand into something different, move. It will not stay stagnant if I just keep feeling what I'm feeling without judgment, right? So
Mhm.
they'll come in and they'll say, I'm in the thick of it. I haven't stopped crying, but at least I'm grieving well. Or, I've been researching how I could maybe get a job in this area because this was true of my story, and I'm really ready to make meaning. And when they know, that's why naming is so valuable, in the process of grieving, which hilarious story to me when for some reason I'm viewing a lot of the Bible humorously lately. I think one of the most deliciously fun stories is of Adam, God asking Adam to name the animals. It's a grief story. So, here's God and Adam. Hey, buddy, I want you to name all these animals and, just whatever you want. And he's like, oh man, like, can I name that aardvark? Like, well, sure you can. Well, what about that? It's huge. Can we name that hippopotamus? Oh my gosh, that tall neck, like giraffe, Okay. And You just imagine the hilarity of God just bringing the animals and Adam naming all the animals. And then what happens? They get to the end, and Adam, his face is downcast and he is plunged into the grief cycle. There is no one like me. And God used naming the animals to help Adam understand desire for a partner, because, of course, Adam had God. They were walking in the garden together. And it was only his loneliness, him understanding sorrow and grief, that elicited the space for him to, she is woman. Like, I will receive her as my partner. That grief, gratitude, you see it in that story. And it comes because God had him name the animals, which is just kind of funny.
This is
Not
insane.
every story's funny like that, though, Michelle. It's just not.
Oh my gosh, but what a beautiful picture you just painted for me, that I would have never looked at it from that perspective. And yet we see that to be true from the start of mankind, as I believe it, as at least, that this is the story. What I am leaving this conversation with is that embrace, just like this podcast name, embrace life. Embrace, hold yourself in this phase, hold yourself in the grief cycle, and find the strength and the redemption through validating
Yes.
each phase that you enter in and out of,
Yeah.
because
Yes, just accepting where you are. And if you want something different, understand that's bargaining, and that you can find something different. Bargaining is not illegitimate, and um it's not unhelpful. You know, when someone finds themselves in a place in life where they're like, I don't want this life that I have, well, they have to actually be able to name that first, coming out of denial. Then go figure out what they might want, which is the bargaining. If I do this, will it feel better? They have to be angry that they've lost so much time. They have to be sad at where they find themselves. And then they find the birth and the explosion of acceptance. I'm doing the best I can. And really, this is going to be the place from which my life going forward, or in this moment of now, births something new. That grief, for those of us who are the living grieving, we have that possibility of hope and meaning making, which, the original introduction of the grief cycle was for those who were dying. And now those of us who are in the living grieving have space to hope. We have space to make meaning. Me in front of you, right here, right now, this is me meaning making out of my story. I live in active grieving, and it is not grievous. It is the space of, I think you would resonate, holy, holy, holy.
I hope that those that didn't know about the grief cycle go on Google and potentially find the right cycle format. Um, if that's the case, Reagan, what should they be looking at searching so they get the appropriate?
Anything about the grief cycle will give information. I think just to understand that those who are living in grieving, there is the sixth phase called meaning making. And oftentimes the grief cycle is, what you'll find is often the 5 phases of grief. So I think the awareness that there is more, that those of us who are actively willing and able to engage the carnage of this beautiful thing called life, there is joy in the midst of it.
Here are my takeaways. Understanding the grief cycle empowers me to dig deeper when I find myself in one of the different phases. I am rooted in soil that strengthens my soul and grows my gratitude at the same time. May this serve as a reminder that you have the spark you need to be the light in your story. Be empowered, and as the name says, embrace Zoe.